Hello, everybody. It's Mother Ann Schneer from Trinity Episcopal Church. As many of you know, today would have been our annual meeting day as a church. And although we're not able to gather because of COVID, and we will attend to business next year in the annual meeting in 2022, we did still send out an annual report to all households by email and snail mail. That did include a written rector's report or rector's address, but I thought since now we are getting more comfortable with the technology, that perhaps I could try a video address as well. So I'm trying that this year. Perhaps it'll be helpful for some people, and if not, that's all right too. So I do want to share some thoughts about this last year, and I thank you for spending some time with me. It's hard to know where to start when reviewing 2020. I was kind of at a loss about where to begin, but when I was sitting down to write this address, I was listening to an album of American folk hymns, and this hymn began playing. My shepherd will supply my need. You probably know it. It goes like this. My shepherd will supply my need. Jehovah is his name. While I was listening, I saw the title of the tune as it was listed on the album, Resignation. You know how different hymns have different tune names, like Amazing Grace's familiar tune is New Britain, and What Child Is This is Green Sleeves. It seemed such an interesting counterpoint to have this paraphrase of the 23rd Psalm, The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, sing to a tune entitled Resignation. We often think of resignation as abdication, walking away, quitting. But that's not all that the hymn is talking about, not even a little bit. It got me thinking about how resignation can mean quitting or the opposite of quitting, walking away or walking toward. You can resign from something or you can resign yourself to something. I thought of how resigning ourselves to something has shaped our life at Trinity this year. We have been resigning ourselves to adapt to COVID restrictions. Actually, we had resigned ourselves to adapting even before COVID hit, when I broke my ankle and we spent months accommodating my change in mobility. We moved the altar. I preached from a wheelchair. We all adjusted. Obviously, members of the altar guild, the choir, acolytes, chalice bearers, and readers had to change where they stood and how they prepared. But even if you weren't involved in those ministries, you had to change when you got communion from me because I was seated. You weren't coming to the altar rail anymore. We had communion stations. Trinity had to resign ourselves to changing conditions in a way that we had not predicted, but we adapted. I sat in front of you with my broken ankle during the last annual meeting and talked about how important it was to connect our treasured past with a dynamic future. We had had an amazing experience as a community in 2019. That had been a very active year. We had the flooding, the renovations, the sabbatical. We talked about the impact of 2019's big events, and we prepared to build on them in 2020. Then the rug was pulled out from under us, as it was for the whole world. We had to completely reframe, reset what 2020 was going to mean to us. We had to reimagine what it meant to be a community of Christians. Who is Trinity during the pandemic? Who are we as a people if we can't gather physically? With these questions in mind, we adapted and we forged ahead. Looking at what we did in the midst of all that loss, I am incredibly proud of Trinity. This set of circumstances has made us reach out beyond ourselves in new ways, particularly utilizing the internet. Of course, we are also reaching out to ourselves. We have been trying to connect while our parish community hasn't been able to gather at 101 East Mansion Street. But as we have done that, we have started to reach other people who are part of our broader community, both within Marshall and well beyond Marshall. We have been showing the truth of our commitment to God. One of the ideas I shared with you all last year was about purpose. I affirmed that we needed to be flexible in how we apply our work to satisfy that purpose. Our job as a church is not to offer 8 a.m. Rite 1 and 10 a.m. Rite 2 with the Book of Common Prayer and the 1982 hymnal. Now, we love those things, we treasure them, but that is not what defines us as a people. What defines us is our commitment to God. I said that Trinity is a place where people encounter the divine. The challenges of 2020 have taught me to rephrase that. We have always said that Trinity is more than a building, but now I would really stress that Trinity is a community where people encounter the divine, not just a place. God has remained with us even as we have been dispersed into our homes, physically separated from one another. That is who we are, and who we have shown ourselves to be over and over in the last year, and will continue. We had lots of plans for 2020 that didn't pan out. Our priorities had to shift because of COVID, but there's a blessing in that as well. We have had to live into the faith that our shepherd will supply our need. We learned how to live stream our worship services to the internet. Sunday morning worship became available on Facebook and YouTube. We added an informal devotional time to our worship offerings, starting with nightly prayers and a song, which ran every single night from March until July. That live evening program continues even now, 4 nights each week. We learned how to use Zoom and other electronic programs, so committee meetings and one-on-one discussions could take place even when distancing requirements were strict. Since worship wasn't being held in person, people mailed their pledges instead of dropping them into the offering plate. Staff and volunteers communicated and adjusted so we could reduce the overlap of people and thus the risk of COVID exposure. And still do things like count donations, check on the building, and change altar hangings. People recorded and submitted videos for our first ever electronic lessons and carols. We discussed politics and social justice honestly and respectfully online, and several members of Trinity participated in local peaceful demonstrations, joining the national cry affirming the dignity of every human being. The pastoral care team connected with folks through cards, phone calls, and notes. I could go on and on about the amazing things that have happened behind the scenes at Trinity. It wasn't easy, but we have managed to remain a community where people encounter God even when circumstances are difficult. What will 2021 bring? We don't know, but we will build on the learning we have started. We hope to expand into offering more ministry opportunities online and develop methods to connect with people who are homebound but are not internet connected. This year has reminded us that God is indeed with us. God has reminded us that God transcends our habits, comforts, and routines. Just as God has called us into new adventures before, God is calling us now to reimagine who we are as God's people. We show that we are a relational people and are not bound to a specific address, time slot, or method of doing things. It's one of the strange gifts that has been folded into the tragedy that is the coronavirus. We have learned to live without the things we can't have and focus on the essential core, the nucleus of what is truly life-giving and valuable. We've cut away parts that we can't have and learned to build in other methods that help us get to that core. The internet is part of that, but so is other connection, writing cards, sending letters, making phone calls. And if we can hold that learning close to us, the knowledge that our community is richer and more mysterious than simply being in the same room at the same time, we will continue to benefit from that learning when we are able to gather in person. We will see our ability to gather as a blessing, not make the gathering an end in itself. I hope that people's willingness to be responsible and the arrival of the vaccine will enable us to see each other again very soon. I also hope that we discover that while some ministries were dormant, they were gathering energy and ideas, waiting for the time when we can unleash our energies. Like a field replenishing its nutrients while it's fallow, I hope that when we return to in-person ministry with renewed vigor, we can do amazing things for God. I look forward to returning and seeing what has changed. Some changes will be obvious, like the air conditioning that has been installed in the parish hall, which will now cool our exercise classes and community dinners. Like the children that have grown since we've seen them last. But other changes will be more subtle and still very precious. Most especially, I hope that we continue to rediscover who God is calling us to be. And I hope that every time God asks us, will you follow me? That we as Trinity will say yes every time. Because this is not the only transition we will ever experience. This is not the only time we will need to practice a holy resignation to our circumstances. This is not the only time we will have to practice trust. Trust that God will supply our needs. This is not the only time we will need to do without what we want. But if we can remain focused on God, we will be okay. And what does okay look like? It doesn't have to look like gathering at 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock with the Book of Common Prayer and the 1982 hymnal. That's just one expression of what okay might look like. Ultimately, okay means listening to God and following God's will, hearing God's voice and following God's path. Now, usually I end the rector's address with a prayer. But today, I'd like to borrow from that great tradition that says, the one who sings prays twice. With that in mind, I invite you to sing with me that song that prompted this train of thought. My shepherd will supply my need, to the tune of resignation. Let us resign ourselves, humble ourselves, submit ourselves to God's will. Let us remember that God is with us in life and death, sickness and health. God is our purpose. God is calling us and waiting for us to show up, to say yes to what God is calling us to do. Let us pray. My shepherd will supply my need. Jehovah is his name. In my breath beside the living stream, he brings my wandering spirit back. Then I forsake his ways and leads me for his mercy's sake in paths of truth and grace. When I walk through the shades of death, thy presence is my stay. One word of thy supporting breath drives all my fears away. Thy hand inside of all my foes doth still my table spread. My cup with blessings overflows. Thy The sure provisions of my God attends me all my days. Oh, may thy house be mine abode, and all my work be praise. There would I find a settled rest, while others go and come. No more a stranger or a guest, but like a child at home. God bless you all. Remember how deeply you are loved by God. Remember the Holy Spirit that binds us all together. And remember that this too shall pass, and that before we know it, we will be gathered as one body, not just spiritually, but physically as well. I love you all. Please pray for me and know I'm praying for you. And we'll see each other soon.